Hey, welcome to another Vectors of Mind / mental disorder podcast. So we were trying to do a live stream because we wanted to check out that new functionality. Ran into some technical issues, maybe because I'm in Mexico, and sometimes things get rolled out and it doesn't always work if you're in a forgotten country. Maybe Canada's a forgotten country sometimes too.
Maybe over-remembered these days.
So I'm with Jonah of Mental Disorder. If you don't subscribe, you should, or if not, subscribe, follow. He's also somewhat active on Notes. Do you want to give a little rundown of what your stack is all about?
Sure. So I write the Mental Disorder Substack. I also have a podcast. This is going to be an episode. And I basically write and talk about mental health, but from a more sort of critical perspective. So looking at how a lot of the things that we do for mental health, are they really working? Are they really backed by evidence? And also looking at mental health from kind of a socio-political perspective. How do our mental health practices and ideas kind of fit into the broader culture and political environment, and how those things all connect. For those who don't know, who might be listening on my podcast, Andrew writes the great Substack Vectors of Mind, which is sort of all about religion and anthropology and psychedelics, and it's hard to explain in a short time, but very much worth checking out Andrew's Substack. You're going to find ideas there you won't find anywhere else.
And today, we're going to talk about somebody from your hometown. Jordan Peterson. There's Jordan Peterson obviously is in a lot of discourse. I think mostly people know him from the politics angle, or they at least know about him because of his politics. We don't have so much to offer there. So we wanted to take kind of a different approach to that.
That's right. In fact, not just my hometown, but my home neighborhood. So I actually grew up across the street from Jordan Peterson. And
did you borrow sugar from him, or?
All I remember is being a kid and sort of seeing his daughter Michaela, because when you're a kid, you don't always register every adult in your neighborhood, right?
Yeah.
But my dad actually was friendly with him and once went into his house. And in his house, he was sort of shocked to see that it was covered wall to wall with Soviet art, which apparently he had bought in auction after the Soviet Union collapsed. But
I didn't realize this is we have like an inside scoop on this.
That's an interesting part of my connection there. But I think Jordan Peterson, what we want to talk about really today is his ideas about psychology and about religion, and then kind of how these all mesh together. So why don't we start with psychology? So, Jordan Peterson is a clinical psychologist, right? He's somebody who, before he got famous for his controversies surrounding, a bill in Canada that was about gender identity, he was a well-known sort of clinical psychologist and personality psychologist. He taught at a lot of places, including at Harvard. And his, research was on addiction, aggression, and personality. And so, that's something that, people know he's a psychologist, but actually, before he got famous, he was a well-known, respected psychologist who I think published a lot, especially on addiction. Isn't that right?
So he taught at Harvard for better part of a decade. He was an assistant professor there in the mid-90s. I found his work kind of a interesting story of the ages of algorithms, but I actually came through his personality psychology work. I was doing my PhD research predicting personality from Facebook statuses. So I was predicting Big Five personality based off what people posted on Facebook. And I was in an engineering program. I didn't really know what the Big Five were. And so I wanted to learn a little bit more. I'd been Googling this. And then YouTube it said, oh, you ought to listen to this 15-part introductory course in personality. This was 2016. So it probably was somewhat boosted by Peterson's politics. But that was just behind the scenes. I didn't know who this guy was. It's just, here's a University of Toronto professor saying what the Big Five are. It was an extremely good lecture. It was surprising. Why is this lecture so good? But it gave me, he was saying things I had never heard before. So at the time, it was really controversial even to say men and women were different. And that Larry Summers, that's how he got evicted as the president of Harvard, was saying that there could be sex differences in mathematical ability or interest. Same with James Damore, actually at the same time. He had this whole framework of personality that clearly went very, very deep. He's a very good lecturer, and so it was helpful in my research. And he also did so on my Substack. I write a lot about the primary factor of personality. So there are aspects of personality that are perhaps more fundamental than the big five. And he, before any of this is back in like 2002, he wrote a paper cited almost 1,000 times about the higher order factors of the big five. And so he did like actual personality work that's highly respected. And then he blew up. And so a lot of times people write him off that he's shallow or uninteresting. I think that if you do that, so my top three interviews he does, because he's a personality, he's a clinical psychologist, he's actually an excellent interviewer. And the top three in my book are John Vervaeke, who's one of his colleagues that he's collaborated with, Ian McGilchrist, and Brian Mudarescu, who wrote The Immortality Key. And so generally, I'm not a huge podcast listener. However, when I want to understand a thinker or I want to understand a book, I will usually go and find all of their interviews. And on, for example, The Immortality Key, Jordan Peterson does better than anyone. So Brian Mudarescu appeared on Rogan with Sam Harris, with Lex Friedman. And I really thought that the Peterson one was the best of all those interviews.
So let's just so those three people. So the first one is, what was his name? The first of the three you mentioned. John Vervaeke. So he's a perceptual psychologist, right? And the second one, what was his name?
Ian McGilchrist.
And what does he do?
He wrote the book The Master and His Emissary. I mean, it's
okay.
kind
so
of like
also like a perceptual cognitive
right,
psychologist,
right brain. But it's also big on, both of those guys are big on propositional logic versus intuition and what we're doing when we're thinking, which is something that I think Peterson's quite good on.
Yes. And then the last guy who wrote The Immortality Key, for those who don't know, The Immortality Key is a book that kind of proposes an alternative history of Christianity and of religion, sort of more generally, focusing it around psychedelic use.
And saying that it's derivative of the Greek mystery cults is one of his big claims.
Yeah. So he's got, a very kind of broad interest in psychology. And I think you're totally right, because when he blew up, people blow up all the time, especially in conservative media. Somebody takes a stand and then they're famous for, a split second. But what kept people coming back is that once he blew up, people started to look him up and they found these psychology lectures. And his psychology lectures that he had posted on YouTube, I mean, he had basically been videotaping his seminars, right? Which could be 15-part seminars he was teaching at Harvard or U of T or whatever. And also sometimes he did these seminars for like I think it was like CBC and like public broadcasting and things like that. And so all of that content, was up there. And for whatever reason, the type of people who are interested in him as a political figure, right, which tended to be people who were, maybe classical liberal to conservative, and they're concerned about overreaches on free speech, they suddenly find his psychology work, and it's just this strong match. And I think a big reason that this resonated so much with people, and young men in particular, he used to get these questions in interviews all the time, like, are you concerned that what you're doing, your lectures appeals to, young men? And he'd be like, well, no, of course not. Like, that's a fine audience to have, right? But I think a big part of the reason it appealed to young men in particular at that time is that, over the last couple of years, psychology has kind of become very fluffy, somewhat feminized, right? And especially if you go to psychology, if you study psychology at university, they often tiptoe around these kind of touchy topics, especially around things like gender differences and stuff. And the view that they give you of psychology is very heavy on social construction. And so it's very much emphasized that, the reason that everything is the way it is, it's mostly because of culture and history and socialization. And there's no like deep essences of anything, right? Like, personality is more about the situations you find yourself in or the way you were raised. There's nothing genetic or intrinsic about that or binding about that. And I think what Peterson, you watch his lectures, 80% of his lectures is just psychology 101 type of stuff, right? Especially for things like personality. But when he talks about things like IQ or Big Five or all this stuff, he's talking about it in a more concrete, way. And I almost want to use the term essentialist. I think that's the wrong term. It's become so politicized. But he's talking about it in terms of some people are like this and they're just like that, right? And that's how you're born or that's how you end up. And it's very hard to change. Now, he
Yeah.
still
So
offers you the
actually,
possibility of change, but that's kind of, some people are right. Some people are born very smart or very dumb, and you got to kind of make the best of where you're at, as opposed to, the common kind of view that you get in a lot of psychology programs is that all of this stuff is kind of systemic and socially constructed, and you need to have political change or, environmental change to make big improvements in basically psychological factors.
Yeah, so actually his higher order factors of the big five. So he says, oh, you can do factor analysis, go from all of the traits we have down to five, but you could go even farther and go down to two and get these super factors, which he and Colin DeYoung, they call plasticity and stability. And then he relates each of these to, I believe it's the dopaminergic and the serotonergic signaling systems. And so he's actually making this claim, which is kind of interesting, that, okay, you do factor analysis and you get these two factors and that they have a biological basis. And that's why all of these very different sorts of personality questions or personality adjectives that they cluster together. It's because they're all drawing from the same biological systems. However, whenever I think about these things, I think of, so is he essentialist like for a human or for an academic? Because I really think if you had a how socially constructed is reality, I still think that he's a like 90th percentile human being on how socially he constructed reality is. It's just that the people in his camp are like all 99th or something like this. Because I think if he's talking to a say a non-expert, just somebody off the street, certainly if it's somebody off the street in an undeveloped country, they're going to be much more essentialist than he is. And so I think that that's a big part of the appeal, is just they've been squabbling on this very extreme part of the spectrum. And so the public sees one person who's a step closer to them, and so obviously he's going to pick up a lot of fans and has more opportunities to be populist.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. And this, I think, also probably changes over the course of his career. When you look at kind of the relationship between his political views and his psychological views and religious views, when he's first getting started, he's much more of a kind of moderate, liberal, kind of a Tory, right? Sort of like traditionalist liberal. And over time, he's, become more conservative. And I think, when you watch older lectures of his, right, there's a lot more room for nuance and balance and stuff. And as time has gone on, that's kind of closed up a bit as well, because it's like the stakes are higher and, but also the audience is different, right?
Yeah. I mean, there's all these things like audience capture, especially if it's a two-party system, which a lot of politics around the world follows the American two-party system. You kind of have to choose a side. But that is maybe less interesting than how his religious views have evolved. So I thought maybe you could tackle what religion is he? What's his idea about what God is, about what the good life is?
Right. So I think we can get there from a number of places, but I think the place to start is kind of in psychology. And so, at some point, he becomes very interested in Jung, right? And Jung is somebody who basically, I think, started out as somewhat of a, he was a Christian, I believe, and basically kind of wanted to explain why in our stories, in our myths, and in our minds, there were all these commonalities, between people across places, across time, across cultures, right? And he ended up coming up with some kind of system that he termed sort of the collective unconscious, right? And so within, consciousness, there is what we can kind of perceive on the, day-to-day level, right? Our thoughts, our feelings, etc. But under the surface, kind of ingrained in there deeply, is what he called, this collective unconscious, which is kind of like, all these kind of myths and archetypes and rituals and all this sort of stuff that sort of underlies all our thinking, and that can sort of be, drawn out and related by things like religion, right? Or stories and things like that. So I think Peterson kind of, a big part of his psychology interest is, okay, it does seem like there are these myths that really resonate with people across time, right? And once we start doing kind of comparative mythology or comparative religion, we can start to see that the same kind of stories, pop up in different places, different cultures across time. So why is that? So I think he starts with kind of the goal of trying to find like a materialist explanation for this. If you watch some of his biblical lectures, which he's done throughout the years, especially the older ones, you'll find him talking about how like the reason that there are these snake myths everywhere is because humans evolved to be very careful of snakes, right?
Yeah, I mean,
And
I always see him very keyed into his snake explanation.
Yes. So he kind of takes like an evo psych lens to try and explain mythology and religion.
He's extremely good on, say, the Eve, or say the serpent in the garden, and what that all was about. And so, even though he's taking a evo psych explanation, he also has a psychological explanation for basically why are there hooks? Why did this story last so long among all the stories that could be told? And I feel like, even though he's just very good at working that into his whole system, oftentimes better even than biblical commentators, although of course it's a mixed bag.
And then he also extends this approach to like the say the Walt Disney stories, right? Like Disney movies, Cinderella, Pinocchio, which goes back also to like the Brothers Grimm, right? And these older tales. And he's kind of trying to make this argument that the reason these stories are so resonant and so popular is because they are tracking some kind of impulse or desire or some kind of almost like learned, I want to say structure or something that you can tap into, right? Like deep within each person, there's some kind of structure that cues you into like how to be a good person or how to be responsible or how to find the right mate or how to watch out for bad people. And these stories kind of then draw that out of people. Do you think that's kind of a fair way to put it?
Although, so I'll say there are times where, because I've heard him talk about Pinocchio. He's like, and he says, "Oh, I don't know how kind of he came up with all this symbolism, but you can just, I Googled him, like, oh, this person was a Mason, or this person, if not Mason, they were interested in alchemy or something." And so it's, there's just this well of symbols. And so it's not, Jung would probably be more on the, you just kind of look in the unconscious, it's there. But there is diffusionist or just kind of genealogical explanations as well for a lot of these symbols.
Yeah, I think like Peterson himself, he was more interested in looking at the bigger picture like you're describing, right? Like what explains this phenomenon more than say trying to prove some kind of collective unconscious or something. One thing that I always think is funny though, and Peterson never talks about this, but Peterson is, spends a lot of his time being anti-Nazi, talking about how much he hated Nazis and stuff. Jung was a very into Nazism, and or maybe that's not quite right, but when he spoke highly of Hitler, he talked about how Hitler was channeling the Aryan unconscious. One thing that Peterson never brings up and that most people forget about Jung, who's kind of been rehabilitated in a way that other figures, even like Freud,
was he ever unhabilitated? Was it ever edgy to like Jung? So it's so weird to me that Jung was never canceled. I think it's because like so many kind of spiritual people like him who are more on the left, although I guess he's popular on the right as well. But there's so many people who like astrology that also like Jung, and they
what is it, IMBT or but it's also like Nietzsche, like if you read Nietzsche word for word, it'd be very easy to cancel this guy. But there's a lot of people, especially on the left, and they like Nietzsche, and so. But just to cap off the Jung thing, so Jung did believe in a collective unconscious, but before that, he believed in different collective unconsciousnesses. He believed that each racial group had their own collective unconscious, basically. So there was like an Aryan consciousness, there was like a black consciousness, like a Jewish consciousness. And so, he believed that like Hitler as a politician was channeling like the collective unconsciousness of, all Aryan people. And
I want to say a little bit about, so not so much on the, like, should we cancel Jung, but So the use I have for Jung is I think that he was one of the most perceptive readers of myths. Because so myths are extremely similar. So creation myths are one thing that's very interesting to me. And they're extremely similar from Australia to the Aztecs to the Bible. But kind of seeing the similarity, you have to really squint. And I think that the Jungian school did a very good job of squinting and largely pulling out true similarities between these things. So they have a much more, I would say, almost magical view of why that is. If you read Jung, I mean, he's somewhat, he obscures this sometimes, but he really believes in things like everything happens for a reason. He was big on synchronicity. Where somebody like, I've spent a little bit more time with Joseph Campbell, who is also from this camp. Joseph Campbell was actually much more of a diffusionist. So he says that the reason that these myths are the same are not because they're stored in the subconscious or the collective unconscious, but because basically successful myths spread all over. And he was pretty explicit that, for example, he said that Australian mythology was derivative and a deteriorated version of Eurasian mythology. And so I guess we have to cancel Campbell as well.
Well, just for the record, I'm not saying we should cancel any of these people. I think you should read them, and I think they're important. And I think it's not. I can totally see why someone like Jung at that time would have thought that, right? Given like the circumstances, and also given the fact that different groups do have different myths and things like that. Although it's been interesting over time to see how similar, right? Often they are more than you would think, right? If it was totally up to chance. But to get back on track, so Peterson, he starts with Jung. There's this interest in kind of the collective unconscious, and kind of grounding all these religious myths and things like that. I think what he then goes on to do is he then starts looking at the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, actually, and he starts to kind of use that as a text to try and kind of show how sort of these myths and these ideas sort of about human action and human behavior and human relations have evolved. And I think this is actually quite a smart idea because the Bible is one of our oldest texts, and it's in some sense, right, it is a psychological text, right? And I say that in two ways. I mean, for one, it shows how behavior changes and evolves over time, and it gives examples and morals kind of about what to do or what not to do, right? I mean, it's pretty clear people behave, well, they're supposed to be rewarded, or if they behave badly, they're supposed to be punished. But you're also supposed to not question sort of what God wants in general, because at the end of the day, you're never gonna, be smarter or better than God, and it's ultimately up to to God. So there's that aspect to it. At the same time, also we can kind of read the Old Testament and then also connecting to the New Testament. We can read those as psychological texts that kind of tell the story of awareness or consciousness increasing. So we can, kind of view these as the stories of people kind of waking up over time, becoming more self-aware, becoming more aware of other people, and over time kind of developing systems of rules and laws and order, which is very, I think, bound up actually in empathy as well, right? And being able to understand, okay, other people have similar, wants and desires as me, and how do we coordinate with each other? And so I think it makes sense to me that, he would kind of look through these texts and be quite entranced by them, because in them, you're not just seeing these kind of archetypal stories, right? Like Cain and Abel or Adam and Eve and things that can teach us a lot, but it's also showing kind of like the evolution of psychology. And as a psychologist, like, how would you not find that fascinating?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of the history of our psyches.
Exactly.
It also appeals to, he really likes suffering. Right, so this is probably partly he went into addiction psychology. He brings up often like what the problem of pain, or maybe not that, but just what do you do about suffering? It seems like what he thinks the good life is picking up the heaviest load you can and bearing that with grace. It's an interesting view of the good life, right?
Well, there's two things on that. So one is that from his personal life, his daughter had very bad, I think it was multiple sclerosis or something like that, was just born or developed at a very young age, this disease where she was in, constant pain. And he himself, before dealing with addiction, I mean, he's clearly someone who's dealt with mood disorders for, probably most of his life. So clearly within his family, there's a lot of pain and suffering. He's a very sensitive person as well. I think that kind of dovetails with his interest in religion, though, because Christianity as a religion, one of the things that makes it unique and one of the ways in which it changed like our psychology is it made suffering meaningful, right? Before Christianity, like suffering was not really considered very meaningful. It was, basically you're fated, things happen. It's like it's all up to the gods, right? And in Christianity, with Jesus on the cross, it basically says like suffering has meaning, has value. And I think this is a message that whether he's aware of it or not is deeply embedded in his own work and in his own psychology, where it's like, yeah, the world is full of suffering, but like, you have to like make the best of it and push through it. And ultimately, it's okay, or it's okay to suffer basically if it's for a higher purpose or something. He talks a lot about, for instance, like, you like taking the biggest load you can bear or whatever, doing the most good you can, even if it's the most pain. And you can see he lives by this philosophy, right? He's constantly in public debates and arguments and taking legal action, all this stuff. Like, total kudos to him. He completely lives by that. But I think it's not the only perspective, right? There's a lot of people who would, probably come from different religious backgrounds or philosophies who would be like, that's silly. Like, life is random. You don't have a lot of control over it. Why suffer? Right? Like why not just, be like an Epicurean, right? Like why not just kind of go with the flow and just have your little life? Or somebody who's, from more of a Buddhist background, they'd be like, of course life is suffering, but the answer is not to engage with that suffering. That's ridiculous, right? The answer is to just recognize it's all sort of illusory. But he kind of brings together the psychology, all this kind of behavioral CBT psychology with this kind of Christian religious kind of ethic, and creates this, I think, very powerful philosophy. So maybe we should, before we go on with the religion to the more modern updates, maybe you can talk about kind of his approach to clinical psychology, because I think this is a good kind of spot to put that in.
Truthfully, I don't know much about the clinical psychology side. So what I've read is on the personality psychology. I will say that he more than from different podcasts I've read of his or listened to, he's more interested in people's relationships with other people. He doesn't think it all comes back to your relationship with yourself. And so I think that also separates him a little bit from the rest of psychology. That he's kind of bearish on how much you can get done that's outside of other relationships.
Yeah, so his approach to clinical psychology, when you listen to his lectures, he talks about it, and also there's interviews with him where he'll talk about, say, his cases and things like that. To some degree, it is standard. Someone has say they're agoraphobic, right? He's doing behavioral therapy with them. He's going to suggest, okay, if you're afraid to go outside, go and look out the door today, and then go back inside, and then tomorrow go and go touch your mailbox, then come back, right? Like there's that aspect to it as well. But what he really emphasizes is kind of this relational aspect, like you're saying, where it's very much about your mental health is your relationship to society in a way, and your relationship in what he would call, a dominance hierarchy, right, or a status hierarchy. So someone who is, living their full potential life is somebody who has a good relationship with themselves, and a good relationship with their family, and a good relationship with their job and their community, right? And it's somebody who is constantly sort of pushing themselves to be the best version of themselves that they can be, right? Again, kind of a typical kind of Christian or religious message of doing service and really putting yourself out there. He does like for instance, he gives advice about, okay, if you're a young man and you're living in your parents' basement and things aren't going well for you, right? You need to get like a minimum wage job and work at that as much as you can. And then eventually you're going to be promoted to the manager of the minimum wage, people. And after that, maybe once you got a little money saved up, you can get your own place. And then maybe, you can learn to attract like a woman. And so it's all about kind of like building out your life from the bottom up and trying to basically like ascend up this kind of, hierarchy, this kind of dominance hierarchy of society. And again, my comment here is that this just reminds me a lot of kind of Christian teachings about, how to be a better person, and service, essentially, right? Of constantly trying to find these hierarchies, whether it's your religious group, or your community, or a job, or whatever, and just kind of like trying to excel and max it out. And this is different than a lot of approaches, which are more internal, right? Trying to change like your own thinking about things, or trying to, tell yourself that actually things are fine and you're better, or trying to address your trauma, right? These are kind of the modern approaches that
Yeah.
are often suggested. And there's debate about how much like real therapists or psychologists would suggest this, but at least from popular psychology and popular media, these are the messages that are broadcast. And Peterson contrasts that with this more kind of classical, traditional message.
Yeah, which is part of the appeal to young men, essentially, is that the father figure say nobody is coming to save you. You got to work yourself out of the pit. For whatever reason, that really appealed to a lot of young men, and obviously still. I think it's a little bit. I remember back in 2016 that people were really worried that he was radicalizing people, which a decade later, it feels a little quaint.
It's just ridiculous. I'm sorry, I'm gonna say it's ridiculous. Like you can object to his message from a left wing, right wing, whatever perspective. But most of what he's saying to people is just like be an upstanding citizen and do well in your relationships and your work. And the messages that people are being sent today by psychology, especially pop psychology and the wellness industry and stuff, is just way more radical. I mean, so, like there's all this kind of stuff about like don't fix your relationships, right? Like just cut people out who are quote unquote toxic, right? And if you have a problem with people, well, you need to like use all this therapy language and all this stuff. And it's just completely a terrible kind of way to approach relationships, because it comes from a place of basically protecting your ego at all costs, as opposed to realizing actually maybe, you're not that great and you need to be the one to kind of work on things. So from there, he's got this approach to psychology that kind of intersects a bit with religion. It's about relationships. Now, one of those relationships you can obviously have is with God, right? Or a higher power, whatever you want to call it. And when Peterson is first doing these lectures, he'll kind of talk about God sometimes, but he's not talking about it in a sort of religious way as a believer. He's talking about it as an academic would, right? So he's talking about God as, say, like a character in a biblical story. And then when he's talking about dominance hierarchies or evolution and that kind of thing, he'll be talking about God as like an abstract, value, right? Like what's the highest thing that could be on this dominance hierarchy, right? Like there's you're at the bottom, then there's like your dad, and then above your dad is like, your boss, and then it's like the mayor, and and then at the very, very, very top is God. And this is a very common approach in psychology, especially psychoanalytic psychology, right? Like Freud basically thought this, right? That God is kind of the abstract representation of your father, or kind of the superego, right? And it's easier basically for most people to imagine, God is this watchful kind of father figure watching you and imposing kind of morals and values and stuff onto you, than it is for them to come to conclusions about what the right thing is to do sort of independently of that. So this is how Peterson kind of starts off. However, what we kind of see happen is once he blows up, he's now surrounded by conservative people, and conservatives, they like a lot of this stuff, but they start to ask him questions like, well, do you believe in God? Are you a Christian? All this stuff like that. And he gives very sort of confusing answers. He says things like, well, what do you mean by believe or God? And a lot of the people who, like him, they sort of accept, they accept the mystery of this, right? But he gets into this debate, this sort of public debate with Sam Harris. And for people who don't know, Sam Harris is a public intellectual, he was one of the new atheists, a very kind of rational atheist type of guy. And so they do a podcast where they're trying to talk about belief in God, and it just kind of goes nowhere. They cannot communicate because Sam Harris is like, well, like, do you think there is like an entity out there that is as real as you and me, that exists, right? That is God, that is all powerful. And he's like, well, like Peterson's like, well, it depends. Like, if I believe that that's true, then there's all these benefits to it. And I don't, who am I to know the real origin of the universe, right? So he kind of goes into these, what we might call, some people have called them postmodernist arguments, which I think is kind of fair,
like kind of existentialist. Yeah. He's like, oh, it's for me, I define true as psychologically useful.
Right. Actually, pragmatist would be the way to describe it, right? So, and again, William James, a psychologist who influenced Peterson as well. And by the way, one cool thing about Peterson is he's a guy who you can tell really read, like actually went and read all of the early psychologists, which is something that almost nobody does anymore. So yeah, pragmatism, right, which is very very influential, by the way, in American ideology and philosophy in general. But he's basically trying to make this argument that, well, it's good, like believing is something that is just good for us, it's good for people, it's good for society, and therefore we should basically be believers. Yeah, at the same time, he's not really willing to say like something concrete. Like there's this one interview with him where somebody was asking him, well, like, do you believe in God? And he says something like, if I did believe in God, it would be crazy. Like I don't think I could even really live up to that, because the reality of that belief, of that existence, is so much to bear, right? Like the fact that there's all these things I've done wrong morally that I need to repent for, and all this stuff like that. So he's kind of occupying this weird kind of position that, personally, my view of it is, when I first started his stuff and listening to him, I thought this is kind of cool, and it makes sense from like a sociological perspective, like that, like if people believe this, then of course there's going to be these effects, and it allows cooperation stuff. But over time, I started to see it a bit of like a magic trick. Like once you know the trick, it's like really boring to watch, because once you see that's kind of what he's doing, then a lot of what he's talking about is actually less interesting. He's really just talking about the importance of God for the importance of belief in God for societies to function and people to behave morally, which is not something that is really, I think, contested that strongly. But
Has he ever talked about, for example, there being tiers of conversation, like I'm having the kids talk now, or that basically some people need to believe in God and others don't, and then just being like an elitist?
no,
Has he ever hinted at something like that?
So he has not, and I kind of wish he would, because I think that's where a lot of smart people end up. And in ending up there, by the way, I should say, doesn't mean you have to be an atheist. Like you can be a believer in God and still believe that what God is, or how people should relate to it, should be different for different people, right? Because most people don't think that if you got a kid who's 5 or 10 years old, you should sit them down and start talking about metaphysics with them, right?
Yeah, so this was during my mission. So I was questioning losing my faith while I was in Cornell, or Ithaca, New York is where I was stationed. And so I happened to be around a lot of professors and like PhD students at Cornell who are Mormons. And so I got to at least obliquely talk to a lot of them. And the people I got along best with were essentially existentialist Mormons. And it was a huge relief. And most of them were there because their wife was a believing, it would tear apart their family. Many of them were unhappy, but some of them weren't. They were just like, some of them were kind of funny. There was this old lawyer guy, just a very funny guy. And he was like fairly out and out existentialist. And he kind of believed that he needed it. He thought like he's a very smart guy, but just his life would go off the rails without this. I do think so. One of the maybe traps I've seen is that most people who start thinking about this, they usually say, but I'm the one who it doesn't apply to. And I think Peterson would be like, whoa, like therein lies hell. It is kind of what I guess he would say about that position.
I think like my issue with this position is two things. For one, I think it's misleading, and I think you can get a lot of people excited about religion or something through this kind of talk, but after you follow it through, a lot of people are going to end up kind of in the position of like, well, I've been told that there's this bundle of goods and social goods that comes from believing this, which is great. And that's all fun and games, when you're getting started. But then once you're actually trying to be, do the practices and the rituals and join the community and stuff, you're going to find yourself surrounded by people who really do believe.
Yeah.
And then you're going to feel like the atheist in that group, even though you're in this, pragmatist, postmodern kind of existentialist thing about it. And so you're never really going to get to where you want to go. And that's my biggest issue with it, is I think it actually interrupts a journey of genuine spiritual discovery to kind of LARP as a believer. Why not, if you think that there's a chance that God exists, or you think that there's, a chance at some kind of real spirituality, why not pursue that authentically, as opposed to trying to use like sociology and social science to like meme yourself into being a believer? I just think I just think that approach is quite dangerous, because you might end up down the line basically still feeling like you're not a part of this, not connected, to spirituality, you end up feeling like you're doing things for practical reasons, which if that's your goal, that's fine. But if you're actually seeking some kind of spiritual connection or connection with God, you're going to be disappointed because you're not taking an authentic path to that.
Yeah, so another funny anecdote about this. Some of the best people I taught as a missionary, so they were a postdoc and I believe a professor of physics, but early in their careers, like early 30s. Extremely, extremely smart people. And she clearly had some sort of like OCD, and she had just had a child and discovered the Mormons, and it just calmed her down a lot. And she saw all these other beautiful children and all these happy mothers, and like it was just like support system. So she was pretty like social pragmatic about this, and she was trying to get her husband involved. And so I got to teach this guy, and it was so good because as a missionary, most of the people you teach are actually illiterate. Like can't actually read. And then so suddenly I have this person who can read, and he's asking great questions. It was I mean, it was great. Also, we got along because they were clearly talking to me because I was kind of on the same leaving. Like I understood their questions.
Yeah.
Whereas my companion just it was just like it had never occurred to him. Anyway, we were trying to get him baptized, but you have to do an interview with the bishop. And he kept failing the interviews because they'd ask, like, do you believe that basically that you have to be baptized Mormon to go to heaven? And he'd always just say no because like in the moment, it was just too much for him to lie on this. And it's funny because almost nobody has ever failed that part of the interview. But he was just such a stickler for like, what does it mean to believe? He couldn't pull the Peterson thing. And so he just was part of the community, but never got baptized and that was kind of enough.
I should say too, I mean, I can see the Peterson thing being more useful for people who don't care as much about the truth of it or the reality of it. And there's a lot of people like that. If you think about it, one of the benefits of being, in a religion is that you have got community, you've got structure, and that is, obviously a good in and of itself. And if you don't particularly care that much about whether Joseph Smith was active and communicated with is it God? Did he get the tablets from God, or am I misreading that?
The angel Moroni, but he was also talking with God briefly.
Thanks. I'm behind on my Mormonism. You need to catch me up sometime. But like whether that happened or not, if that question doesn't really matter to you or doesn't really get under your skin, then yeah, like, get the benefits, join up with that, But if you're somebody who actually cares about it and you're actually seeking some kind of, religious clarity or spiritual clarity, then I think it's not going to help you in the long run. I think in the long run, it's going to make it more complicated for you. So
I want to say a little bit about what I like about Peterson's approach. So what I think that he articulates well, especially in this conversation with John Vervaeke, is that you have this relationship with yourself, and that's just moment to moment. And there's almost infinite places you can put your attention, and that's going to affect this relationship with yourself. And then it's harder than that because your life lasts a long time. So you've got this moment to moment all of the time, and also you have to have a correct relationship with your future and past selves as well. And then the problem is, okay, like you are doing this process, and then you're a social creature and have to interface with other people also doing this process in different parts of their journey. And then we all have to do this together to have a healthy society. And he thinks that myth and religion is what got pounded out of this evolutionary force to have good in the sense of practical, pragmatic, useful life history strategies. And so I think that that's basically true, and that people get too hung up on the propositional logic of did Cain and Abel actually exist? It's really silly, and especially whatever in the post-internet kind of the Reddit atheism. that a book like East of Eden, there's just not as many people writing East of Eden at this point, which is a book about Cain and Abel. And so that's what I like about Jordan Peterson. And that I just think that there's so much in culture that has been passed down thousands or tens of thousands of years that we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And that's the part of the project of his that I really appreciate.
Yeah, I think the thing I disagree with maybe is just the factual or truth aspect of it. Because first of all, if you look at his political views, it's basically all about the truth, right? And it's all about the importance of, say, having unbiased scientific inquiry, or being able to say, there's only two genders, right? These are like questions about truth, about the nature of things. And I think people have rightly pointed out that once it turns to the topic of, say, like, did Jesus rise from the dead, right? He is, way more sort of like punting on those questions. Now, over time, I think he's sort of been pushed to be, through his own life experience and stuff. He's actually, I think, accepted just a more traditional religious view. He'll now say things in interview like he thinks, Jesus walked out of the tomb after being crucified and stuff. So I think he's gone more down the path of like a believer. And But my point is that the philosophy that he's kind of been articulating for quite a long time has actually not been that. And people talk, these days sometimes about sort of right-wing postmodernism, which is like an interesting topic in and of itself. And, how new is that really? Because people say it's like a newer thing. I don't really think it's new necessarily. I think it's, gone back quite a while. But the one thing I'll say is I think the Petersonian kind of message around religion has really fed into that or expanded that. And has kind of, I think, primed a lot of, younger men to think about questions, basically to think that, if there is truth that interferes with, society's well-being, or truth that interferes with kind of people having normal social relations, then it's okay to kind of punt on those questions or to try and ignore them. And the reason I find that, a little disturbing is that, the whole kind of battle of civilization is, or maybe of history or whatever, is between people who preserve the social order and people who question the social order, right? It's between Jesus and the Romans, or it's between, Socrates and the Greeks. So I kind of think I get where he's coming from. I just think that ultimately it sends the wrong message to, not to everybody, maybe to 70, 80% of people. This is great advice for how to be happy and how to live a well-adjusted life. But I think it sends the wrong message about valuing truth and honesty in our thinking about society.
Yeah, I mean, so you open that saying maybe you disagree. I don't think there's any disagreement between us on that.
Right. And so maybe for both of us, it's like we'd like a little bit more elitism or a little bit more Straussianism from him, just like a little bit more like wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like, but that's not coming from him because he himself, I think, is not that type of person, or is not committed to that kind of thinking. So maybe we can talk about then kind of his, his evolution on his religious views, because he ends up meeting this guy named Jonathan Pageau, who I think kind of crystallizes his thinking that bridges, back from the Jungian psychology up to his kind of updated views on Christianity. Can you explain, like, what is it that Jonathan Pageau brings to the table that just, basically gets Peterson very excited and influences his view of religion?
Actually, I'm just going to play a reverse on that. I think Pageau better than me.
All right. So Jonathan Pageau I think he's like a painter or an artist or something initially.
His background was in, he studied religion, I thought.
I think both, but let me see. I could be confusing him with another one of Jordan Peterson's friends. Let me just see. Yeah, he's a liturgical artist, writer, and public speaker. So he does carvings. That's it. He does carvings. So he's this artistic guy, but also, very well spoken and very knowledgeable about religion. And Pageau kind of makes these arguments that are actually in some ways, funnily enough, reminiscent of old postmodernist arguments that, like, reality is a text, which someone like Peterson would hate. But he makes these arguments that, well, really it's all kind of like everything's kind of a story, right? And our attention, where we pay attention in life, is sort of determined by stories. So, that's what myths are for. Myths are these stories that tell us, like, hey, care about this, right? Watch out for the evil queen. or watch out for your scheming brother, but pay attention to saving the maiden. They kind of orient our attention towards things, right? Including towards like God. And what Pageau kind of tries to show is that since reality is kind of like the story, we can think about questions that are religious in nature more in terms of sort of the narrative value that they provide and the way in which they structure our lives. And this kind of leads Peterson to, at one point in an interview, say things like, God is like the ultimate character, right? In a book, and to think about, basically reality as textual. And so Peterson starts to say things in interviews more along the lines of like, well, when we say did Cain and Abel exist, what do we really mean by that, right? Because did they like there's one level to that, which is like, well, is the story like accurate? And it's like, maybe. There's another level like, were there two brothers named Cain and Abel? And it's like, maybe. But then there's this question of like, is the relationship between Cain and Abel, between those two brothers that we see in that text, is that like a real relationship? Is that true? And by true, what we mean is like, is that a pattern of behavior that has like enduring consistency across time? When we look at the resurrection story, right, or the story of Jesus, or even of Moses, or any of these people, like whether or not those events are historically accurate, are they true in the sense of they describe a pattern of behavior that is resonant across time? And it gets into debates like, well, is Sherlock Holmes real? Well, obviously he's not. He's a made up character, but in a sense, he has this enduring influence over all of us, and Sherlock Holmes is more real than Zobby the detective that I just made up right now. Like there are kind of these degrees of, and again, this is like what blows my mind is all of this is really covered in postmodernism, right? Like this is all sort of postmodernist stuff that's just kind of rephrased in religious language, talking about the real versus the virtual and all this stuff. But basically, Pageau brings him to this place where he's more comfortable accepting that maybe the whole universe works in this more narrative way, and maybe there's kind of underlying everything. It is all just kind of narrative, and it is just all kind of patterns. And we don't need to get so hung up on whether things are true in a literal sense, or whether we need to believe in things in a literal sense, because what is narrative is actually above the literal. And now it's almost like we're talking about Platonic forms or something, but in terms of like myths and narratives, it's like there's this higher level of narrative, of story that like is higher than everything else. And I guess one way we could, if we're trying to be imaginative, we could think about that as like, imagine, there's a script, right? Like imagine we're all in a play or a movie or a book, and there is someone's written a script above that, and they're going to use the same motifs over and over again. And so, when the motif comes up, it's significant, and it's not, when the motif of the dragon comes up, right? It's not like random, and it's not like, oh, are dragons real or not? Like, no, someone's putting the dragons in there. The dragons exist, but it's coming from some higher place. It's not necessarily like existing in the same way that, this cup exists that's in front of me or something like that.
Yeah, I think that was kind of that turn was too bad, right?
I mean, it's interesting. I just think I think he's trying to make everything work. He's got all these beliefs, some of which like he's clearly changed his mind on, and he's trying to fit everything together without sacrificing anything. And my issue with that is it's just like I just think it's all way too much together, and so you end up kind of having to have this worldview where like stories and narratives are the only real thing, or like the main real thing. And what does that even really mean? Like, it's hard to say.
I think part of it, so I like reading Jung or Campbell or Freud on the Bible. They're really willing to put themselves above the Bible, right? So they just treat it like a text, right? And it seems like part of Jordan Peterson's awe with the Bible is he doesn't want to put himself above it. And so like kind of the main, if you're not willing to really stand above the Bible, you have to say that Jesus came back from the dead. Like that's pretty black and white in there.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. But again, I think it says something about how similar actually religion and postmodernism or these kind of postmodernist views can be, right? And people have good reasons for holding, I think, postmodernist views a lot of the time. I don't necessarily like agree with them, but there's a lot of, there's a lot of people who genuinely ask, how can we know what's true, right? Or how can we know what's right? These are all relative. We have limited information, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what we kind of see with Jordan Peterson is sort of a similar thing. It's sort of like trying to apologize for not wanting to come down one side or another. And so what do? Is you kind of have to have this bigger overarching worldview that says everything is real in some way. And so I can like say things are true or not true, or that I believe or don't believe. And it's kind of always going to be right. So at the end of the day, I think it's kind of a cop out. And I kind of wish that he had stuck to a more consistent path. Yeah, I mean that's where he's at now. He just released this book, We Who Wrestle with God. I tried to read a little bit of it, and I was pretty disappointed. It's just very hard to read. It's just him going through kind of the biblical stories from the Old Testament, kind of adding his commentary. And in that book, he says things like, I think I sent it to you, right? It's like he says something like God is like the main character or something. I'm trying to find it. That God, he says in the opening chapter that God is a character, right? So like, yeah, I mean, it's true, obviously, that in like if you read it like a text, and God is a character in the Old Testament. But I don't really see I don't think Freud, when he was writing, would have said something like that, and I don't think that a Christian, a true believer, would say God is a character, right? Like I just don't think. I think the place he's ended up in is this kind of weird textual kind of place where it's all very like literary, and it's just not so different from postmodernism. So I almost want to say like mission failed, like to some degree. Like, he had to work through all these contradictions and things, but I feel like he ended up back at the place he was trying to avoid. So, yeah, I know what you think about that.
I think one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast is so my blog is about or makes the case that Genesis is a memory of cultural evolution, of essentially finding metacognition or I am, and that is the story that's recorded in Genesis of the fall of Adam and Eve. And so I go on various podcasts and talk about my crazy snake cult idea. And one thing, because humans care about narrative so much, they don't care if something is true or not. So people ask, so who are the winners? If your theory is true, who are the winners? And in one of these, I said Jordan Peterson. Because I actually really do think that if the Old Testament is a memory of some really important event in human history, that he would be among the biggest winners.
But you know what? Like, I agree with you up until recently. But now that he's embraced these newer ideas that are just, like less grounded in reality, I don't know if he can make that claim anymore. Or if he wants to make that claim, it's not really consistent with his overall philosophy.
I mean, it's funny.
But I wish he had stuck it out
I am
long
much more
enough
of a literalist
to meet you,
right?
and have
like
that conversation.
I'm more of a literalist on the Garden of Eden stuff. Like I don't think it's there used to be a green place. No, I think that we used to be living in our super ego, and there used to be no ego, and then we found our ego. So I'm pretty I'm pretty liberal on that. There was a snake in the garden. The ritual used snake venom. But in some ways, like if you accept that, then you don't have to be like you can still find a lot of value in these stories, and I would say stories of any culture, without taking them literally on things like the resurrection. And that so he basically has had to be literal on the most salient question of group membership now, which is you're Christian if you believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so because that is the question of group membership, there's a lot of pressure on that. But I still think that he'd be quite the winner. If so I mean, who knows? I think that we tend to find out, I believe in science, we tend to find out the truth over long enough time periods, especially we're getting more genetic data, which is relevant on this. So who knows, maybe it's 50 years, maybe it's 10 years. If it's on a short enough, if we start taking these stories more seriously and he's still in the cultural arena, then that he would be a big winner.
Yeah, I'm also like, I'm not going to pretend that I'm not going to pretend that like he's going to be able to get everything right or whatever. There is quite a long literature. Maybe it's kind of hidden or whatever, but there's lots of people, even from religious perspectives, writing about these older texts and writing about them in this more kind of psychological way, like you were describing, right? And it's not just psychologists like Freud are doing that, but a lot of religious studies kind of people have done that, and religious scholars too. I mean, I think when you read these old texts, I think you can be more literal. I think there's kind of this space in between, like being, how do I put this? It's kind of complicated. I think some of the stories are clearly like made up, but there's also a lot about it that is probably less made up than we would think, right? Like when we read some of these older stories, and it's I got a message from God or whatever. People sometimes will interpret this as like, oh, it's they're talking about the universe, right? Or people thought they had some kind of people were making this up basically, or they're thinking, oh, the person who wrote the story is putting God in as a character or something. But there's a lot of people who theorize that basically everyone was schizophrenic until not that long ago, and
Yep.
people had voices in their heads and things coming in that were talking to them, giving them messages, or people's basically consciousness as they were developing were not well integrated, and so people were believing that voice, which we now just think of as our like conscious or whatever, or our inner narrative or something, was external. And again, I think he could have done a lot of productive stuff going down that route and keeping a bit more of a it doesn't have to be completely materialist exactly, but just keeping a bit more of a scientific approach to it versus kind of throwing his hands up and being like, well, I guess all this stuff is kind of true and untrue, and it just depends on what you mean by true. And like, I find that to be a little bit of a disappointment.
It says we, a couple of random podcasters. I do want to. We have this note here about Peterson as a New Age thinker. Why is that there?
Yeah, I think that's something you can kind of conclude because I mean, New Age stuff is kind of people who take psychology and they kind of cherry pick religion, and they put those together and they tell you like how to improve your life, right? Like here's how you can do yoga and meditation and mindfulness and follow psychoanalysis, and you combine those things and you're going to get a promotion. Whereas traditional religion tended to kind of take those forces and push them into people being more community oriented, right, or serving other people. New Age is very self-focused and focuses on how I can improve my mental health, or I can improve my social standing or whatever. So the reason I say that is because I think ultimately, and maybe this has changed to some degree, but that's kind of what Jordan Peterson is a self-help author in a lot of ways, right? I mean, his book 12 Rules for Life, this is a self-help book. I think there's a lot of value in self-help if it's good. And I think he's provided a lot of value to a lot of people. So I'm not trying to say his self-help is bad. I think it's quite good. I'm just saying I think it's an interesting thing to think about. That is he real? Like is he just kind of a more sciencey conservative version of somebody like I don't know, Dr. Phil, or somebody like what's that guy's name? Not Deepak Chopra. It's the guy who something Mate. Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
He writes books about trauma. Mate, trauma. Let me see. Gabor Mate. I mean, it's just something to think about in terms of where he fits into all of this stuff. That ultimately his advice is directed towards individuals and is directed towards self-improvement. There's this kind of critique of him that I think comes from the right, on some factions of the right, kind of like Bronze Age pervert and those types of people. For those who don't know Bronze Age pervert, he's this kind of rogue philosopher. And he basically makes arguments that people like Peterson, who are telling you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get a job and settle down with a wife, and they're kind of screwing you because ultimately you're not going to be happy as a young man, and today you're not going to be happy in the current system, which is basically just exists to kind of suck value out of you and make you subservient to other people, and so you're better off kind of going your own way. And that's kind of been one of the criticisms of him from the right, I think, by people like that. Is
I mean, it's ultimately like Christian versus not. Like that is the Christian story that, I mean, Christ washed everybody's feet. Like that is the purpose of life, is to take upon yourself the Christ. And so Peterson really is Christian on that.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting question to ask. So like, for instance, think about Peterson contrasted with somebody like Andrew Tate. I want to say right at the beginning, I don't endorse or like, what Andrew Tate does. He's a terrible person. I think he should be in jail, etc. But if you look at, the messages someone like Andrew Tate is sending to young men, he's basically saying like, look, if you want to be successful in life, you need to like make a bunch of money, try and have sex with as many women as possible. You need to be tough and threatening and intimidating and make people afraid of you and build a band of brothers, right? Somebody like Peterson would say, "Oh, that's really just juvenile, and you're like Peter Pan, right? Like you want to go be on your own island." But the real men, they take responsibility and stuff like that. I think it's an interesting question, for young men today. I think the advice that Peterson's giving is pretty good. It's hard to deny it. But at the same time, I think, it is a good question. If you believe that the society that we currently live in isn't really fair, right? If you think like you're not going to have a good chance at home ownership, or if you think that maintaining a marriage or a relationship or whatever is excessively difficult, then why would you buy into that system, right? That just seems like a no-go. Versus if you think, the way to success is to take a lot of risk and to be less devoted to, say, a community or to a religion and more devoted to yourself and your own personal fulfillment and maximizing, say, the amount of money that you can make and women that you can engage with, then you're going to find Peterson's message to be kind of misleading, basically.
I think that that's one of the reasons I'm somewhat defensive of Peterson, is that I think that what he's describing is positive sum, and that almost all of the other systems are not positive sum, and it's just extremely precious that we have stumbled upon this positive sum cultural script. So that's one of the things I thought about a lot, like as I was leaving. The basic, one of the reasons I was able to leave the faith is basically because I'm healthy. I had the time to think about it. But it would have been much more difficult if I was in a worse situation. And then something I've realized, so living in that religious community where everybody has those ideas, and there's so many problems, but in the end, everybody at least has this positive sum feeling. And then you realize that if you are the final, like if you just live by the sword, it's not more relaxing. And also it's this strange thing that Peterson, part of what he's saying is for people to fight, for people to take responsibility, or like basically to compete, like go up the status hierarchy, all of that. But it's built within this framework of your value is how much you help other people, stuff like that. The only lasting happiness is weaving yourself slowly together into society. And so I think that's a functional script.
It is a functional script. And at the same time, I can see how, like just to give, some example, right? It's kind of well known these days that if you want to make more money, it's good to do job hopping, right? So if you're an engineer, right? If you want to increase your salary, you go work at one place for like a year or two, then you go to another place and another place. Like this has just been, shown to increase the amount of money that you're going to make a lot more than staying at the same place. And it's also kind of well known that people who are very, very good workers, right, and just stay at the same company, it's like they have the loyalty of that company, but the company then often, they don't always reward you for the loyalty, right? Because they're like, oh, well, okay, we don't need to worry about keeping this person.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like, I just think that's an example where, the kind of just, I don't know what Peterson's opinion on that would be, right? Maybe he would tell you, oh, switch companies, improve your money or whatever. Like there is that self-improvement aspect to it. But I also think that there's it's missing a little bit of that individual edge of, sometimes there are systems and situations that aren't fair or where you're not going to be rewarded for doing the right thing. And how should you react to that? I think that is, again, the advice is, mostly on the money, but I don't think it's super useful for what do you do in those kinds of situations where maybe it isn't positive sum or where you're actually better off forging your own path.
I mean, his own life has been more forging your own path, 99th percentile, let's say. Right? So he really, really was, he has an impulse to fight. And so it's hard for me to think that he's not teaching people, like he's teaching people to be a pushover, basically, given that that's perhaps a criticism, is that he's too aggressive on some things.
And then what else do we have to talk about? I guess, let's think about, so at the end of the day, we've talked about his kind of psychology, we've talked about his religious views, kind of linked in with some of his politics. Um, you know, he talks a lot about meaning, right? And what he sort of thinks meaning is kind of when all these things in your life are aligned, right? So he'll talk about order and chaos, right? And meaning is kind of like when they're kind of balanced, right? Like things are comfortable enough like that you can navigate the world and not be freaked out, but there's also things that are changing and new opportunities that you can access. The garden, the term paradise, right, literally means walled garden. It's that kind of idea, that kind of balance. And he wants you to kind of have to have meaning in your life. It's about relationships, it's about family. It's kind of about purpose and being driven to sacrifice, yourself for other people. I think that is the message he's been sending. And a lot of people, particularly young men, it seems, have really grabbed onto that. And I think for some people, they've sort of felt that the culture prior to that was telling them that, meaning either doesn't exist, right? It's like nihilism, like there is no meaning, or that the things are meaningful are just it's purely material, right? It's about how much you make or how much you own, or that meaning is kind of like something cheap, right? It's like a cheap experience that you can have, like, oh, you watch a movie, it feels meaningful, and then it goes away. So what do you think of his kind of understanding of meaning? Do you think it's convincing? Do you think it's ultimately something that is positive? Do you have any issue with it?
I think it's ultimately pragmatic. I think that Scott Alexander covered this question once in an essay. Do you recall that? Scott Alexander is also concerned with is there any meaning? And he reviewed one of Peterson's books and basically came up he doesn't answer it. But yeah, that would probably be my position as well. Is that it's a pragmatic answer, but I wouldn't defer to him on this.
Well, I think it's good advice. It's good advice for life. And I guess it depends what people mean by people mean by meaning, right? When we say meaning, what we really mean is significance, I think most of the time, right? Is my life significant, or are my actions significant, right? Does it matter? So if you're an isolated unit, right? Like if it's just you in your parents' basement or something like that, you don't really matter. You're not really significant, right? If we think about it from a dominance hierarchy standpoint, you're just like at the bottom. Once you're a community member, okay, you matter to the community, right? That's a little bit. Maybe you're still at the bottom of that, but at least, you matter like to somebody, like somebody cares about you. And then you have a job, and then you matter at the job and a relationship and stuff like that. And so over time, you kind of build up that sense of like local meaning, essentially. And, then you have a kid or something like that. And when you have a kid, you're extremely significant to your kid, right? So you have meaning there in that sense. So I think this is a very kind of practical way to achieve meaning. If by meaning we just mean sort of significance. I don't really know whether it actually makes sense as a way to achieve meaning in the grander sense, which is I think
Which
what a
is
lot
what
of
he
people are
means,
after.
right? He's
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
platonic
Like
level.
like I think through going all these things, in your life, it gives you meaning. I don't know if if this is actually what gets you to the meaning of life, or to like this kind of grand, religious thing, or to God, or whatever it might be. And that's kind of the part of it that I found a little puzzling. Is yeah, it's great advice. You're going to definitely increase like the amount of meaning you have in your life in this kind of local sense. But is act like if you're a nihilist and you do these things, how much is that going to shift your nihilism? Maybe you can't be like, maybe you can't afford to be a nihilist, right? Once you have a kid, because okay, my kid needs some instruction growing up. I can't be a nihilist, right? I'm going to put them in religious school. Or maybe you can't be a nihilist when you have a job because, oh, I'm going to lose my job. I'll lose my job if I think time doesn't matter, right? Or there's no point to the job. But a lot of people have like genuine like existential questions, okay? Like genuine existential questions, but like, what the hell is all of this about, right? Like, what's the meaning of life? Does God exist? Does anything I do matter? Am I living like are we in eternal recurrence? Is there like all these are all like genuine spiritual questions, and they're questions about meaning, right? Like, is my life significant? Is there any significance to any of this life? I ultimately don't think that he has any answer to that, and I think his path to meaning that he outlines is not going to give you that. And so maybe that's just he's a psychologist again, right? He's actually not a theologian.
Yeah,
Maybe he's a bit of a philosopher.
I think that he might answer like this: that essentially everything is action. That let's say you have doubts and you're 50% sure that nihilism is true, and then you're 50% sure that say like your child matters. And then you just act like your child matters. And then by the virtue of habit, you start to, like, if you fake it till you make it and you embody it, and then suddenly you believe it. I think that might be how he answers that. That's also pretty close to just the standard, like, Mormon version of faith, you would say. That, like, you don't know these things, but you act as if they're true, and then they become more true as you act them out, or it becomes more natural for them to be true. And so I think maybe he would take just a very common religious approach to that answer.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. And again, he's not, I think he's arguing that he can give you meaning, but he's not promising I'm going to make everything make sense, right? But it does bug me. Like, let me say why it bugs me again, because he talks a lot about nihilism, right? He talks about Nietzsche and the problem of nihilism and all this stuff. I think he kind of misunderstands.
And he likes Nietzsche. He likes Nietzsche.
Yeah. I think he kind of misunderstands Nietzsche a bit, but that's a separate thing. He talks about the problem of nihilism, right? And his solution to that is kind of to embrace all of these meaning frameworks and all this religious stuff, right? But he doesn't actually deal with the problem. I don't think he really rejects nihilism as his metaphysical view. Maybe he's recently done this with the narrative stuff, but for most of his work and his psychology and his religious stuff, he's not rejecting nihilism. He's basically being nihilism is really bad. How do you deal with that? Well, the answer to that is you need to kind of have systems that give you meaning, and it's a little bit of time. But having, spent a lot of time reading his stuff, listening to his lectures, I just don't think he really gives a compelling reason to reject nihilism factually. He kind of, you're right. He ends up as kind of an existentialist figure at the end of the day, as someone who's kind of saying to you, I don't know what the truth is about this. Things seem pretty bleak. Life seems full of suffering. Isn't it better to believe? Isn't it better to try? And because it seems like for most of human history, when we've done this, it's gone pretty well. And so why don't you do that too? And it's not the worst answer in the world. It's pretty successful for a lot of people. I just don't think it can solve nihilism in the same way that genuine religious faith can, right? Or in the same way that belief in God or something like that can. Or at least belief in a non-nihilistic universe, right? Whatever that might look like.
He came from psychology, right? So he's solving the psychological problem, and he's drawing very deeply, more deeply than most psychologists do, from philosophy and religion. But ultimately, it's a psychology problem.
Yeah, so maybe the problem is he starts with the psychology, he becomes this more religious person over time, but ultimately he can only offer you psychological solutions, really, because that's really what he is, right? And so maybe it's wrong to criticize him for that. Maybe it's acceptable because he's kind of, gone into that territory. But yeah, I think those are interesting questions to ask. I guess we can sort of wrap this up by saying, whatever you think about the guy, I know some people love him, some people hate him. You got to admit he's interesting. You got to admit that he comes from, very interesting background. His research and his thinking about religion and philosophy and all this stuff is just incredibly thought-provoking. And he clearly has had, I think, the biggest impact of any psychologist in a long, long, long time. I honestly can't think of the last time a psychologist was this influential in the culture and in politics, for that matter.
Power poses,
probably power poses. And I think he's going to be one of the people that, years from now, people are studying him as a figure like Freud or something like that, as somebody who, came onto the scene and had some wacky ideas, had some useful ideas, but ultimately changed the way that people behaved. And I think a lot of the current sort of revival of religion you can see is to a decent degree attributable to him. I think a lot of younger men becoming conservative. He provides kind of a smart, educated, and social science-based argument for a lot of conservative kind of thinking and policy positions, or classical liberal at least. I don't think he considers himself to be right-wing necessarily. So yeah, very interesting, very influential. I have some quibbles with his things, but maybe I'm asking too much of him. But yeah, ultimately...
Yeah, I mean, come on, what's the meaning of life, Jonah? We have like 5 minutes left.
Well, I can't say I figured it out either, but I'm not going around promising I can improve the amount of meaning in people's lives. So,
Yeah. So
um,
the 12 Rules of Life, it has, I was looking up on Amazon, 82,000 reviews and a 4.7 star rating. I don't think I've ever seen a book with that high, with that many. So yeah, he probably has. And we'll see. We'll see when time passes if it's Freud or Jung. But he's been extremely influential. Uh, I I think a lot of the criticism of him doesn't land because he's an interesting thinker, and he had, like you said, he actually did come from reading deeply in his field. And so yeah, I'm a I'm a fan, I guess.
yeah, I'm a fan too. I guess very last thing I'll say is it also shows just how life and politics can influence people's thinking about these topics, right? I think if he hadn't kind of blown up as he did in the media, and if he hadn't kind of been brought into more conservative circles, maybe he would have continued with this more kind of secular approach and not gone down the more traditional religious, pathway. And I think it's just interesting to kind of observe his changes over time and ending up at a place that's more postmodernist when his kind of one of his life goals was sort of challenge nihilism and postmodernism. What does that tell us? I guess it tells us to some degree that, maybe people like me who are trying to get to the root of things, what's the truth about, you know, religion, or what's the meaning of life? Like maybe we're fundamentally the deluded ones in terms of, wanting to be able to answer questions that are never going to be answered. And maybe at the end of the day, the postmodernists win and the religious people win. And ultimately things are, much sketchier and more contextual than we'd like them to be. I hope that's not true, but it's hard to deny that that seems to be the direction that things are going in these days. And with more information, it only seems to be, sort of getting to be a bigger thing. And I will do my best to fight that. But at the same time, maybe that's maybe the meaning of life is just trying to figure it all out and figure out those interpretations. And yeah, that's my two
Yeah,
cents.
I also want to close with something a little bit ecumenical. So I'm rereading East of Eden right now, and there's Sam Hammond and his wife. And Samuel Hammond, he's kind of a poet. His job is a blacksmith, but he's interested in reading, interested in other people, interested in the world. And he does lots of debates about Cain and Abel, like what does this mean? And then his wife is just extremely practical. Only book she's ever read is the Bible. She just reads it over and over and over again. And they have a number of children. I forget how many. It's 5 or more. And one of them dies, and it just destroys Samuel. Like he had always just radiated happiness. And then this was just too much, broke him. He was never himself again. And then his wife she'd always just kind of made dinner, very practical, always gave him a hard time. But she's like, it's just, life, like this is one more bad thing in life and I'm going to go to heaven eventually. And it's interesting because obviously Steinbeck is closer to the poet. Like he's close to the poet. He's writing a book of debating what Cain and Abel means, but he has this character in there who clearly outshines him in the practical matters of bearing a child. And so he's putting this in there as saying like, okay, this is how I am, but like who knows if it's the best way to go about things. And so partly because of family members who are still religious, all of that, you kind of see how they gain strength, and also that you can't really change a lot of people. And so I do think that we ought to be ecumenical about things, and that ultimately, like some people, it could be they're wired, or that was their life history, and that kind of by your fruits you shall know them. That as long as people are giving advice that tends towards truth, love, positive sum games, if you wanted to be more game theoretical about it. So those are the most important things that I think that we ought to judge one another on.
Well, in that sense, we should judge Jordan Peterson highly. Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I hope listeners enjoy it, whether it's on my podcast or Andrew's. Go subscribe to the other one. I think you'll find that there's some similarities and some differences in how we look at things, but very psychological. And yeah, if these kinds of conversations are interesting to you too, let us know. Maybe we could do more of them, kind of talking about psychology figures, because that's something that we're both very interested in.